My name is David, and I've been married to Margaret for over 35 years. We've lived through many things together, some good, some bad, but I always thought our bond was unshakable. We built a life based on routine, on quiet stability. Our marriage, while never full of grand passion or wild adventures, was comfortable. Margaret was the love of my life, my companion, my partner. We didn't need much to be happy: a modest home, a steady income, and time spent with each other. We met when we were both in our early 20s. I was just starting out as an accountant, while she was already established as a teacher in the local school system. I admired her immediately. Margaret had this warmth about her, an air of calm that put people at ease. She had a way with children that I couldn't quite understand, but I respected it. She would come home from school with stories of her students, the small victories in her classroom, and the challenges of managing kids who seemed impossible. I would listen to her with genuine interest, despite not really knowing the world she inhabited. We never had children. It wasn't something we planned, nor was it something we actively avoided. We simply never felt the need. In some ways, I think Margaret felt that she had enough children to care for at school, and I, truthfully, was content with the life we had. Our evenings were spent watching television, talking about our day, or sometimes in silence. It was a peaceful existence, predictable, and not without its comforts. We had enough money to live comfortably, but not extravagantly. We didn't travel much, preferring instead to save for the future. There were no grand gestures, no passionate trips abroad, but there was something satisfying in the simplicity of it all. As we entered our 50s, the rhythms of life remained largely unchanged. Margaret continued her work as a teacher, her commitment unwavering. She loved her job, or at least, I thought she did. I never questioned her dedication to her students or the countless hours she spent grading papers, planning lessons, and attending school events. I didn't mind the late nights or weekends spent at the school. I knew it was part of her nature, her commitment to doing good in the world. And I kept up with my work in accounting, a field I found steady, predictable, and deeply satisfying in its own way. I never had aspirations for anything more, and the older I got, the more content I became with the life I built. It wasn't extraordinary, but it worked for us. I worked during the week, and we spent weekends together, nothing grand, just quiet time at home. We didn't have much in the way of social activities, but that suited us both. The occasional dinner with friends, a neighborly chat now and then, but no large gatherings or extravagant vacations. Our home, modest as it was, felt like our little world. But somewhere along the way, something began to change. It started small: Margaret spending more time at school, staying late after her usual hours, coming home tired, but never really explaining why. I didn't think much of it at first. She had always been dedicated, after all. But as the years passed, I started noticing things that didn't sit right with me. Little things. The way she would smile when talking about certain colleagues, her teacher friends. How she seemed a little more distant when we sat together at night. At first, I chalked it up to age. After all, we were both 60 now. It's natural to settle into a rhythm, right? But deep down, I felt it, a subtle shift in the air between us. Something was off. I didn't want to admit it, but I think I was beginning to feel the creeping effects of time. Our relationship had settled into a comfortable rut, but it was the kind of rut that left me feeling disconnected. It wasn't an outright problem, not at first. But with each passing year, I felt less and less of her presence, and more of her absence. I would catch her lost in thought, staring out the window as if there was something more out there that she was longing for. Margaret would always tell me how much she enjoyed her students, how rewarding it was to see them learn and grow. I never questioned it, not until one evening when things began to unravel. It was around this time, in our quiet suburban neighborhood, that I noticed a name slipping from her lips more often than I was comfortable with: Mr. Walker. At first, I thought nothing of it. Teachers often mentioned their colleagues, especially in schools where staff worked closely together. But then, it started to feel different. The way she spoke about him, so casually, yet with an intensity that caught my attention. Mr. Walker was a teacher at her school, she told me. A new one, just starting out. He taught history, and apparently they had struck up a friendship. I didn't know what to make of it. Margaret had always been friendly, but this felt. Her eyes would light up when she spoke of it, and she would often mention how they stayed after school to talk about lesson plans, the future of education, and the struggles of being teachers in a world that seemed to value everything else over education. I started to notice these conversations happening more frequently. I told myself I was being paranoid. She was just talking about a colleague, but deep down, I knew something was off. It wasn't long before the late nights at school became a regular occurrence. She would tell me how busy she was, how they were staying late to prepare for upcoming exams, how they were discussing the next school event. But every time she came home, I noticed something, a change in her demeanor, a new glow in her eyes. She never seemed upset, never tired in the way she had been before. Instead, she seemed energized. And then, one night, it happened. Margaret came home later than usual, her eyes bright, but her face flushed. She told me Mr. Walker had given her a ride home because it had gotten too late, and she hadn't wanted to drive in the dark. I wasn't angry, not at first. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. She had never asked anyone for a ride before. This was a new development, a shift I couldn't ignore. The changes were subtle at first. Too subtle for me to notice, perhaps because I didn't want to see them. But they were there, lurking beneath the surface, small shifts in Margaret's behavior that gnawed at me. At first, it was just her tiredness. She began coming home late from school more often, her eyes tired, but not in the way I was used to. It was as if she was exhausted from something else, something I wasn't a part of. The long, drawn-out sighs as she dropped her bag by the door, the way her gaze would drift away from me when I asked about her day. There were no long stories, no enthusiastic recounts of what had happened in class. She was distant, her mind somewhere else. And I, in my quiet frustration, wondered where that somewhere else was. I tried to be patient. After all, we were both getting older. Work had been demanding for her. Teaching had never been easy. But there was more to it, something deeper, something I couldn't ignore, even if I tried. Then, there was the way she spoke of Mr. Walker, the new teacher at her school. I don't even know why I paid attention at first. It was just a name. But she spoke of him so often, with a tone I hadn't heard before, one that wasn't quite innocent, not quite casual. It wasn't the kind of mention that was typical for someone just talking about a colleague. No, this was different. She talked about him with a strange kind of admiration, almost reverence. He's so passionate about history, David. You should hear him speak about it. You can see the fire in his eyes, she said one evening, sitting across from me at dinner. I tried to smile and nod, but inside, something twisted. What was she telling me this? What did it matter? And then she went on to describe how Mr. Walker would stay late with her after school, the two of them poring over lesson plans, discussing ideas. At first, I assumed it was just work talk, but as time went on, I began to see the way her eyes sparkled when she mentioned him. There was an energy in her voice I hadn't heard in years. This was no ordinary colleague. And there were the little things, the tiny moments that seemed so insignificant at first, but now felt like fractures in our marriage. When she returned from work after long hours at school, she didn't rush to me as she used to. There were no soft embraces, no kiss on the cheek. Instead, she would brush past me, her movements quick, almost dismissive. And when I tried to engage her, to draw her into conversation, she would give half-hearted answers and turn back to her phone with a television. It was as if she was distracted by something I couldn't see, or worse, someone. It was a Tuesday evening when she came home late again. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright in a way I hadn't seen before. She mentioned Mr. Walker again. This time, she told me he had given her a ride home, that it had gotten so late after their lesson planning session that she didn't feel comfortable driving by herself. The words hung in the air like a cold mist. I wanted to say something, ask her why, question her. But I didn't. I couldn't. I just nodded, unable to push the thought from my mind. Why had she never asked anyone for a ride before? Why was this the first time? I watched her as she went about her evening routine, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. I could hear the soft clink of her jewelry as she removed it, the quiet rustle of her clothes as she changed. And yet, everything felt different. She wasn't the same woman who had once held me close, who had wrapped me in her warmth after a long day's work. No, there was a chill now, a coldness in the way she moved, in the way she spoke. She was slipping away from me, and I wasn't sure I could stop it. She turned to me then, her eyes meeting mine for the first time that evening. There was something vulnerable in them, something uncertain. She looked at me like she was searching for something that, deep down, I knew I couldn't give her, not anymore. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words never came. Instead, she simply looked away, almost as if ashamed. That was the moment, the moment I felt it, the thing I had been ignoring for so long. There was someone else. She wasn't just spending extra hours at school. She wasn't just talking about a colleague. No, there was something deeper, something more intimate, something that I was a part of. And the realization hit me hard, like a punch to the gut. But I didn't say anything. I couldn't. What could I say? How could I confront her when I wasn't even sure of what I had seen? Instead, I watched her retreat into herself, retreat into that place where I no longer belonged. She went to bed early that night, curling up beneath the covers, leaving me alone with the weight of my thoughts. I lay awake for hours, listening to her soft breathing beside me, and I wondered, how long had this been going on? How long had I been blind to the reality of our marriage, to the distance that had grown between us? There was no anger in me, not yet. Just this hollow ache, this unbearable awareness that the woman I had known for so many years was now slipping through my fingers, and I couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. The days following the unsettling sense that something had shifted between Margaret and I seemed to stretch on forever. What had once felt like a solid foundation, a life built on years of shared memories, now felt fragile, as though it might collapse at any moment. I could feel it in the way she looked at me, or more precisely, in the way she didn't look at me. Her gaze had become distant, clouded, as if she were seeing something or someone else. I had tried to ignore it, told myself that it was just a phase, that we were both getting older, that our lives had naturally begun to take different paths. But deep down, I knew. There was something she wasn't telling me, something that had crept into our lives like a shadow, unnoticed until it was too late to stop it. One evening, I found myself alone in the living room, sitting in the armchair that had once been ours, but now felt like a relic of a life long gone. I stared out the window, my mind racing, my thoughts tangled in a web of suspicion and confusion. Then, I noticed the phone. Margaret had always been secretive about her phone. It had never bothered me before, her keeping it with her at all times, her turning the screen down when she placed it on the table. But tonight, something felt different. The phone was on the counter, her purse beside it, abandoned as though she had left in a hurry. I couldn't explain why, but an overwhelming sense of urgency took hold of me. My hand moved on its own, as though my body knew what I needed before I did. I picked up the phone, heart racing, and unlocked it. There, in the recent messages, I sighed, a name that was both familiar and Walter. I hadn't heard the name in years, but I knew who he was. He had been a colleague of Margaret's, someone I had met at a school event all those years ago. He had always been polite, distant, nothing that had ever raised suspicion. But now, the messages between them painted a different picture. The words on the screen were sharp, intimate, and full of longing. There were photos of them together in places I had never been. Smiles, touches, whispers. My stomach turned as I scrolled through the messages, each one more damning than the last. There were late-night exchanges, plans to meet when I wasn't around. The tone was unmistakable. This was more than friendship. It was something deeper, something secret, something that had been hidden from me. I felt my pulse quicken, my hands shaking as I read the words, each one a dagger to my heart. The betrayal was undeniable. The realization hit me like a freight train, knocking the breath out of me. All this time, Margaret had been hiding her affection for me, sneaking around, playing a game I had never even known was being played. And how blind I had been, how trusting, how foolish. I stood frozen, the phone still in my hands, as the world seemed to spin around me. The house felt foreign now, like a place where I no longer belonged. The walls that had once been filled with laughter, with memories, now felt empty and cold. Everything about our life together, everything about the years we had spent side by side, suddenly felt like a lie. The weight of the truth crashed down on me, and in that moment, I felt something break inside of me. It wasn't just the shock, the disbelief, it was something deeper. It was the realization that the woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted with my heart, had chosen someone else. She had given herself to me in ways I would never understand, and I was left in the wake of it all, a man whose life had been turned upside down in an instant. I didn't know what to do next. My mind was a swirl of emotions, anger, hurt, confusion, and something darker that I couldn't name. I couldn't even bring myself to confront her, to ask the questions that were gnawing at me. How long had this been going on? Why had she done it? Had I missed the signs? The questions were endless, but none of them mattered. The betrayal had already been done. The silence in the house was deafening. The sounds of Margaret's footsteps, the little things she did around the house, had all faded into the background of my mind, replaced by this new reality. The phone felt like a burning weight in my hands, but I couldn't put it down. I couldn't stop scrolling through the messages, through the evidence of her infidelity. It felt like some dark ritual, a cruel punishment I was inflicting on myself, but I couldn't stop. It was as though I needed to know everything, to see it all laid bare, even if it shattered me further. And then, as I sat there, the cold truth settled in. I wasn't just her husband. I wasn't just the man who had stood by her all these years. I was the man who had been left behind, the man who had been replaced, the man who had been deceived. I looked up, my vision blurry with unshed tears, my body trembling with the force of what I had just discovered. It wasn't just the affair that hurt. It was the realization that I had never truly known her, that the woman I thought I loved had been living a life that I hadn't even been a part of. The betrayal wasn't just about her and Walker. It was about everything I had believed, everything that I had thought was real. In that moment, I knew something had to change. Something would have to give. The weight of her betrayal was too much to carry on my own, and the rage inside me began to bubble up, dark and uncontrollable. I had been blindsided, but I would not remain a victim, not for long. The days after Margaret's betrayal dragged on like an endless, suffocating fog. The weight of what had happened, what she had done, pressed down on me in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the affair that gnawed at my soul, but the years I had spent blind to the truth, the years I had wasted trusting her, loving her. All of it was a lie, an illusion I had built in my mind, and now it all crumbled. There was a sharpness to the air around me, an ever-present tension that seemed to vibrate through every corner of the house. The quiet, want to comfort, had become oppressive. The space between Margaret and me had grown, not just in distance, but in a deep, irrevocable chasm. I had learned what it felt like to be betrayed, to be broken in a way that could never be fixed. I began to watch everything around me with a cold detachment. The world continued as it always had, but for me, it felt like I was moving through a dream, each step heavier than the last. I watched Margaret, but she had already changed. She wasn't the woman I had married. She was a stranger, wrapped in guilt, but also something else, fear, maybe. There was something in the way she avoided my gaze, the way she couldn't seem to stay in one place, as if she were waiting for something. It was then that the idea began to take root in my mind, a seed planted in the darkest corner of my thoughts, growing slowly at first, but then swelling with every passing day. The thought of Walker, of the man who had taken my wife from me, became a constant presence in my mind. His face was everywhere. His smile, his touch, his very existence had violated everything I had built. And with that realization came another. I needed to make him pay. The urge was primal, something that came from deep within me. I couldn't simply walk away, couldn't simply let it go. What he had done to me, to us, could never be forgiven. My mind churned with images of him, of his smug face, his arrogance. I could almost hear his voice in my head, taunting me, mocking me for my weakness. The days bled into one another, and still, I watched. I followed him when he left his house in the morning, when he went to work, when he returned in the evening. I watched every movement he made, studied him as if he were a specimen under a microscope. I needed to know everything about him, every weakness, every flaw. I needed to find the right moment. In the weeks that passed, I realized that nothing I had done, nothing I had felt, would ever change what had happened. Margaret was gone. She had already made her choice. And now, I was left with only one choice of my own. I tracked him one evening, as I had done before. Only this time, I wasn't simply observing. I was preparing. My body felt like a taut string, pulled tight and ready to snap. I waited until he was walking home, alone, through the same path he always took. He was unaware of my presence, too focused on his own thoughts to see the shadow that followed him. He walked with a casual air, the very image of contentment, unaware of the storm that was about to strike. The moment came swiftly. Without hesitation, I closed the distance between us, stepping out of the darkness with the weight of my decisions pressing down on me. The air was thick with tension, with finality. I moved with purpose, driven by a rage so pure and consuming that nothing else mattered. He turned just as I reached him, his eyes widening in confusion. But by then, it was too late. The anger that had festered in me for so long came to a boiling point, and the cold, sharp blade of a knife met its mark. I felt the resistance of his flash as it gave way, the warmth of his blood seeping over my hands. His gasp echoed in my ears, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. I stood over him as he crumpled to the ground, his life draining out of him in an instant. The world around us felt distant, unreal, as if I had stepped outside of time itself. His eyes, wide with shock and disbelief, stared up at me, but I couldn't find the satisfaction I had expected. There was no relief, no peace in what I had done, just the hollow echo of a decision that could never be undone. I walked away from the scene, leaving him behind, and the world around me felt as if it were collapsing in on itself. The action was final, but it didn't bring closure. There was nothing to fill the void that had opened up inside me. The damage was done, but it felt like nothing had truly changed. I had killed him, yes, but the truth remained. Margaret's betrayal would never leave me. And then, I realized something else. Margaret would know. She would find out. She would understand what I had done and the path I had taken to get here. She would be the next to feel the consequences. The world outside seemed untouched by the chaos I had unleashed. The city continued its steady hum, indifferent to the life-altering choices I had made. But inside, everything was different. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. I could no longer escape the truth, the hollow feeling that had taken root in my chest. It wasn't just the death of a man that haunted me, but the death of everything I had once believed. My marriage, my sense of self, my place in the world, everything had been shattered beyond repair. Margaret was gone. She had disappeared in the wake of the storm I had caused, and with her, any semblance of peace I might have hoped to salvage. The house, now eerily quiet, seemed to reflect the emptiness inside me. I wandered through the rooms, touching the walls, running my fingers across the furniture, as if some part of me could still cling to the past. But it was all slipping away. Every memory, every moment I had shared with her, every belief I had held on to about who we. The act of killing Walker had done nothing to fill the gaping hole in my soul. If anything, it had made it deeper, more cavernous. The man was gone, but the agony of betrayal remained, gnawing at me from the inside. I had thought that his death would somehow restore balance, would bring justice for what he had done, but I had only sealed my own fate. The act was irreversible, a decision that had driven a wedge between me and the woman I had loved for so long. Margaret, for all her anger and disdain, had disappeared into the night, leaving me behind to deal with the consequences of our mutual destruction. I had watched her go, watched as she left with the same coldness I had seen in her eyes the moment I first learned of her betrayal. It wasn't guilt or regret that drove her away. It was something else entirely. She had become a stranger to me, and now I, too, had become a stranger to myself. I had hoped, in the silence that followed, for some kind of epiphany, some spark of clarity that would bring me back from the edge. But none came. I sat in the dark, staring at the empty spaces we had once filled with our shared life. The house seemed to close in on me, each shadow stretching farther, darker. The walls felt like they were closing in, trapping me in the very reality I had created. I had once loved Margaret with all my heart. I had once believed in us, in the life we had built together. But now, those feelings felt like echoes, distant and fading, unable to reach me through the fog of resentment and loss. It was as if everything we had been was a lie, a delicate facade that had crumbled the moment I uncovered the truth. I had killed a man to avenge that lie, But in doing so, I had lost everything else. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself no longer in the house that once held the echoes of my life with Margaret. Instead, I was confined to the sterile, suffocating walls of a prison cell. The moment they took me away, the gravity of what I had done came crashing down with a force I wasn't prepared for. The arrest had been swift. The neighbors must have heard the commotion, the sound of the struggle, the final thud as Walker's body hit the ground. By the time I had stepped out into the night, his blood on my hands and my heart a mix of rage and regret, the flashing red and blue lights were already painting the street. The officers approached cautiously, their voices firm, but I didn't resist. How could I? The truth was evident, written in my every movement, my every breath. I surrendered myself without a word, letting the cold steel of handcuffs bite into my wrists. As they read me my rights, I barely registered the words. My mind was still in that room, replaying the scene over and over, the way his face had contorted in surprise and fear, the way Margaret had screamed, the raw, unfiltered rage that had driven me to act. The trial came quickly. There was no need for drawn-out investigations. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses had seen me leave the scene, and Margaret's testimony sealed my fate. She recounted everything, the arguments, the escalating tension, and finally, the act itself. Her voice, devoid of emotion, was what broke me the most. She had already detached herself from me, from us, and from the wreckage of our life together. When the verdict was read, I felt no surprise, no shock. Guilty. The word echoed in the courtroom and in my mind, a judgment I had already passed on myself. The sentence was handed down, decades behind bars, a life stripped of freedom, spent paying for the violence I had unleashed. Prison was a world apart from anything I had known. The routines were monotonous, the walls closing in tighter with each passing day. The other inmates regarded me with indifference or curiosity, but I kept to myself. I wasn't here to make friends or alliances. I was here to endure the consequences of my actions. Every night, as I lay on the thin mattress of my cell, I replayed the events that had led me here. I thought of Margaret, not just the betrayal, but the years before, the life we had built, the love that had once seemed so unshakable. I wondered where she was now, what she was doing, whether she thought of me. Did she carry any guilt for the lies she had told, the choices she had made that had driven us to this breaking point? Or had she moved on completely, leaving me to bear the weight of it all alone? The days blended together, each one a mirror of the last. I tried to tell myself that I had acted out of a sense of justice, that Walker had deserved what he got, but deep down, I knew the truth. My actions hadn't been about justice. They had been about anger, about pain, about the desperate need to regain some semblance of control in a life that had spiraled beyond my grasp. Now, control was a distant memory. My life belonged to the system, to the guards who patrolled the corridors, to the rigid schedules and unyielding walls. And yet, the punishment that cut the deepest wasn't the loss of freedom. It was the knowledge that I had become the very thing I had despised. I had let my rage consume me, and in doing so, I had destroyed everything I had once held dear. Margaret's absence was the most painful reminder of all. She had left, not just physically, but in every sense that mattered. Her betrayal had set this chain of events in motion, but it was my own hand that had struck the final blow. Now, I was left with nothing but the memory of what we once had and the bitter reality of what I had become. In the stillness of my cell, I thought of the life that could have been, the choices I could have made differently, but those thoughts offered no solace. The past was a closed door, and I was locked away with the consequences of my actions. As the days turned into months, I began to accept that this was my reality. The man I had been was gone, and the life I had known was over. What remained was only the cold, unyielding truth of a single, irreversible moment, and the knowledge that, in seeking revenge, I had destroyed us all. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Got thoughts or experiences you'd like to share? Drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.